London, the Chancery Division of the High Court, December 31st, 1970. The sky is the color of wet slate. Inside the building, the air is thick with the smell of floor wax and old paper. There are no cameras, no screaming fans, no flashbulbs. There is only a clerk and a set of documents titled McCartney versus Apple Corps, Limited, and others. The others are John Ono Lennon, George Harrison, and Richard Starkey. On the final day of the decade that they had defined, Paul McCartney filed a writ to dissolve the partnership of the Beatles. It was a cold, clinical act of self-preservation that the world would mistake for a betrayal. Paul was not in London when the papers were filed. He was at High Park Farm in Kintyre, Scotland, a place of mud, sheep, and grey mist. He was 28 years old, bearded and exhausted. He spent his days riding a tractor and his nights drinking whiskey. He was the man who had written Yesterday and Hey Jude, and now he was the man who was suing his best friends. I was thought to be the guy who broke the Beatles up and the bastard who sued his mates, he would later tell Barry Miles. And believe me, I bought into that. It's a heavy thing to have on your head. The psychological weight of the lawsuit was a byproduct of a systemic trap. Paul had realized that the only way to save the music was to destroy the company that owned it. To sue Alan Klein, the manager he distrusted, he had to sue the three men who had signed with him. There was no other door out of the room. The room had begun to shrink years earlier. Brian Epstein died in August 1967, leaving the Beatles without management for the first time in their professional careers. The vacuum was immediate and terrifying. "We were like lost children," Paul said in a 1984 interview. Brian had handled everything. The bookings, the contracts, the money. We just played music. When he died, we suddenly had to become businessmen, and none of us knew how. The solution had been to create Apple Corps, a company that would function as both a business entity and an artistic experiment. "We wanted to do things differently," John Lennon explained to Rolling Stone in 1970. "We wanted to help young artists, fund films, open boutiques. We thought we could be different from the other capitalist pigs. We were wrong." By early 1969, Apple Corps was a disaster. The boutique at 94 Baker Street had failed within months, giving away its remaining inventory in December 1967 rather than liquidating properly. The Apple Electronics division, run by a Greek inventor named Magic Alex, who promised futuristic recording equipment, produced nothing functional. The Apple Studios at 3 Savile Row was poorly designed and acoustically problematic. Most critically, the Western front office had become a gathering place for hangers-on, artists who submitted no work, and staff who collected salaries for undefined roles. "There were people on the payroll who I'd never even met," Paul said in the anthology documentary. "We were hemorrhaging money. Nobody knew who was spending what or why." Derek Taylor, the press officer, later described the atmosphere at Apple. "It was chaos pretending to be creative freedom. People would come in at noon, sit around discussing revolutionary ideas, eat expensive lunches, and leave by 4. The Beatles would show up occasionally, realize nothing was working, and leave in frustration. Nobody was in charge because everyone was supposed to be equal. But equality without structure is just expensive anarchy." Alistair Taylor, who had been with the Beatles since the Cavern days, recalled, "By 1969, we were spending £80,000 a week and making nothing. The Beatles were rich in assets, but cash poor. If they wanted to buy a house, they'd have to ask Apple for a loan from their own company. It was absurd." Into this vacuum stepped Alan Klein. He was a street-smart American manager who had built his reputation by aggressively auditing record companies on behalf of artists like Sam Cooke and the Rolling Stones. Klein had a reputation for getting money out of labels, John said in 1970. "That's what we needed. We needed someone who could go to EMI and Capitol and say, 'You've been screwing these boys and now you're going to pay.'" Paul wanted his in-laws. I wanted Klein. The conflict was rooted in class and psychology. Paul had married Linda Eastman, whose father Lee and brother John were entertainment lawyers in New York. They represented established artists and moved in circles of wealth and discretion. Klein was the opposite, loud, profane, and confrontational. Klein was working class, John said. He understood what it was like to be screwed by people in suits. The Eastmans were the people in suits. The battle lines were drawn in January 1969 during a series of meetings at the Dorchester Hotel and Apple's offices. Paul argued for the Eastmans, who had offered to audit Apple's books for free and restructure the company. John, George, and Ringo met separately with Klein, who arrived with a briefcase full of documents showing how much money EMI owed the Beatles in unpaid royalties. Klein showed us the numbers, Ringo recalled in Anthology. He said, "You're owed millions and I can get it for you." We believed him. Paul didn't. Paul wanted his family to do it. We thought that was nepotism. George was more blunt in a 1977 interview. Paul wanted to control the band through his in-laws. We weren't going to let that happen. So we went with Klein. In hindsight, we should have gone with nobody. We should have hired accountants and lawyers and kept it simple. But we wanted a father figure. Brian was dead. Klein seemed like he could fill that role. The vote was 3-1. On May 9, 1969, John, George, and Ringo signed a management contract with Klein, giving him 20% of their gross income and significant control over Apple's operations. Paul refused to sign. "I told them Klein was dodgy," Paul said in 1971. "I'd done research. I'd spoken to Mick Jagger, who warned me about him, but they wouldn't listen. They thought I was being precious, trying to keep control. I wasn't. I was trying to protect what we'd built." The legal structure of the Beatles partnership meant that Paul was outvoted, but still bound by the majority decision. Klein took control of Apple Corps despite Paul's objections. "That's when I knew I'd have to sue," Paul said decades later. "Not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice." The deterioration of the personal relationships accelerated through 1969. During the Get Back sessions in January, captured on film by Michael Lindsay Hogg, the four Beatles barely functioned as a band. Paul attempted to organize rehearsals and impose structure. George, resentful of Paul's dominance, quit on January 10th, saying, "See you around the clubs." He returned days later, only after the others agreed to abandon the live performance concept and record an album instead. The problem was, nobody wanted to be there except Paul, Lindsay Hogg recalled. John was with Yoko, mentally checked out. George wanted to be a solo artist. Ringo was trying to keep the peace. Paul was trying to keep the band together by force of will, and that just made everyone resent him more. John's psychological distance became total after he and Yoko began using heroin regularly in the spring of 1969. "I was in a different world," John admitted in 1970. "The Beatles seemed like something from my past. I was more interested in what Yoko and I were doing, the bed-ins, the peace campaign, the avant-garde stuff. The Beatles felt like a job I was obligated to show up for." When the sessions for Abbey Road began in July, John participated but treated it as a contractual obligation. "We owed EMI one more album," he said. "So we made one. It was professional. It was good, but it wasn't real anymore. We were faking it." George was writing his best songs and getting minimal space on Beatles albums. "I had All Things Must Pass ready in 1969, he said in a 1987 interview. "I played it for the band. They weren't interested. I had Isn't It a Pity, Let It Down, Hear Me Lord, all these songs that eventually made my triple album. But the Beatles didn't want them. They'd rather record one of Paul's granny songs than give me a second song on an album." The resentment was compounded by the democratic pretense. "We said we were equal," George noted, "but we weren't. John and Paul were the Beatles. Ringo and I were sidemen who happened to share the profits. And by 1969, I didn't want to be a sideman anymore. Ringo's position was the most heartbreaking. He had no solo ambitions, no desire to leave. I just wanted to play drums with my mates, he said in Anthology. But they weren't mates anymore. They were business partners who disliked each other. During Abbey Road, he was given Octopus's Garden as his token contribution, a pleasant but slight song that underscored his peripheral status. Ringo knew he wasn't essential, George Martin said in a 1992 interview. In the studio, we could have used session drummers. On Beatles records, we sometimes did. Ringo's value was in being Ringo, the stable one, the funny one, the one who kept perspective. But in 1969, nobody wanted perspective. They wanted out. On September 20th, 1969, during a meeting at Apple, John announced he was leaving the Beatles. I said, "I want a divorce," John recalled in his Lennon Remembers interview. Just like that. I told them I'd been thinking about it for months and I decided. I was done. Paul started crying. George was relieved. Ringo looked confused. Klein, who was present, immediately told John to keep the decision private. Klein said if we announced it before renegotiating the EMI contract, we'd lose leverage, Paul explained years later. So John agreed to stay quiet, which meant we had to keep pretending the band existed, even though John had already quit. It was insane. The charade continued through the fall. Abbey Road was released in October to massive success. The public believed the Beatles were still together. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Paul's response to the secret breakup was to pour himself into music. He retreated to Scotland in late 1969 and began recording alone using a 4-track machine. "I didn't know what else to do," he said. "The band was over, but I wasn't allowed to say it. So I made an album." The result was McCartney, a rough, homemade collection of songs recorded entirely by Paul. It was scheduled for release in April 1970. When Klein learned of Paul's plans, he ordered Paul to delay the release to avoid competing with Let It Be, the Get Back album that Phil Spector was still mixing. Paul refused. "I'd had enough of being told what to do," he said. "It was my album. I'd made it myself. I was releasing it when I wanted." Klein sent Ringo to Paul's house at Cavendish Avenue to deliver the message personally. Ringo arrived on March 31st, 1970, carrying a letter from Klein and a mix of goodwill and dread. "I didn't want to go," Ringo said in Anthology. "I knew Paul would be angry, but John and George said I had to be the one because Paul might actually listen to me." The conversation was brief and brutal. Paul read the letter, which ordered him to postpone his album. He looked at Ringo and said no. Ringo tried to explain that it was for the good of the band, that Let It Be needed space. Paul said there was no band anymore. Ringo said they were still contractually obligated. Paul shouted, "I'm finishing my record and it's coming out." He physically removed Ringo from his house. "I basically threw him out," Paul admitted in 1984. "I regretted it immediately, but I was so angry. Angry at Klein, angry at John and George for sending Ringo, angry at the whole situation." The press release for McCartney, distributed in April 1970, included a self-interview that functioned as Paul's public statement about the breakup. He asked himself, "Do you foresee a time when Lennon-McCartney becomes an active songwriting partnership again?" His answer was, no. He asked, "Are you planning a new album or single with the Beatles?" Answer, no. The world reacted with shock and grief. Headlines declared, "Paul quits Beatles." John was furious that Paul had stolen his narrative. "I started the band, I disbanded it," John told Jan Wenner. "But Paul had to be the one to announce it, to make it look like his decision. He couldn't let me have that." The bitterness was mutual and profound. Through the spring and summer of 1970, Paul's isolation deepened. He received death threats from fans who blamed him for breaking up the band. Critics savaged the McCartney album, calling it self-indulgent and underproduced. Klein continued to manage Apple and control the money. Paul's royalties from Beatles sales went into the partnership account, which Klein administered. I was making music that was earning millions, and I couldn't access my own money without Klein's approval, Paul said. I was working for a man I'd never hired and couldn't fire. The Eastmans advised him that the only legal remedy was to dissolve the partnership entirely. That meant suing Apple Corps, and that meant suing John, George, and Ringo. The decision tormented him. I didn't sleep, Paul told Miles. I'd lie awake thinking, if I do this, I'm the one who legally ends the Beatles. I'm the villain. But if I don't do this, Klein controls everything forever. Linda McCartney described him as depressed to the point of dysfunction. He'd stay in bed until afternoon, she said in a 1989 interview. He'd drink too much. He'd sit with his guitar and not play it. He felt trapped. The farm in Scotland, purchased as a retreat, became a form of self-imposed exile. We were hiding, Paul said, from the press, from the fans, from the other Beatles, from the whole mess. On December 31st, 1970, Paul's lawyers filed the writ. The case was titled McCartney versus Lennon, Harrison, Starkey, and Apple Corps. The claim sought the appointment of a receiver to manage the Beatles' business affairs and the formal dissolution of the partnership. The timing was symbolic. The last day of the decade, the final severance of the 60s dream. Paul's affidavit, filed in February 1971, was a detailed 43-page document outlining the deterioration of the partnership and the financial mismanagement under Klein. He cited specific examples. The way The Long and Winding Road had been remixed by Phil Spector without his consent, adding strings and choirs that he found excessive. The record was released without my approval. The affidavit stated, I have no control over my own work. He described the impossibility of working in a 3-to-1 voting structure. Any proposal I make is voted down. I'm outnumbered in every decision. He noted Klein's conflicts of interest and questionable accounting practices. I do not trust this man with my life's work. The document was clinical and devastating. John's affidavit, filed in response, was dismissive and personal. He characterized Paul's objections as the tantrums of a spoiled child who has always got his own way. He defended Klein's management, arguing that Klein had successfully renegotiated the EMI contract and increased their royalty rates. Klein has done more for us in 2 years than anyone else ever did, John's statement claimed. He accused Paul of trying to impose his in-laws on the band. Paul wanted to turn the Beatles into a family business controlled by the Eastmans. He described Paul's behavior during the Abbey Road sessions as domineering. Paul would not accept anyone's suggestions. He wanted to control everything. The statement was designed to wound, and it succeeded. George's affidavit was longer and more reflective. He described years of frustration as a junior partner. I was allowed 1 or 2 songs per album, he wrote. My best material was rejected or ignored. I was told my songs were not good enough, not commercial enough, not Beatles enough. He recounted specific incidents, playing All Things Must Pass at a session and being told it wasn't suitable, offering Isn't It a Pity and having it dismissed, watching Paul rearrange his songs without consultation. Paul would take my guitar parts and tell me to play them differently. He would add piano parts I hadn't asked for. He would change my lyrics. George's resentment of Klein was less than John's devotion, but still substantial. Klein is not perfect, but he treats me with more respect than Paul ever did. Klein listens to my album ideas. Klein supports my solo work. Paul only wanted me to be a Beatles guitarist. Ringo's affidavit was brief and sad. He described himself as someone who just wanted to play drums and make music with my friends. He recounted the 1968 incident when he temporarily quit and returned to find flowers on his drum kit. I thought that meant they valued me, he wrote. I thought we had solved our problems, but the problems were bigger than flowers. He defended Klein mildly, saying the manager had been fair and efficient, but his primary message was bewilderment. "I don't understand the legal and financial details," Ringo's statement admitted. "I trusted Brian to handle that. After Brian died, I trusted the others to make good decisions. I signed what I was told to sign. Now I am being sued by one of my best friends, and I don't fully understand why." The trial commenced in February 1971 before Mr. Justice Stamp in the Chancery Division. The courtroom was wood-paneled and austere. Lawyers in horsehair wigs examined documents, contracts, letters, accounting ledgers, affidavits. The Beatles themselves did not appear. Paul was represented by David Hurst, QC. The other three were represented by Morris Finer, QC. The legal arguments centered on whether a receiver was necessary and whether the partnership could continue. Paul's team argued that the partnership had ceased to function and that Klein's management was detrimental. The defense argued that disagreements were normal and that dissolving the partnership would cause greater financial harm. Testimony included detailed examination of the Let It Be album production. Paul's lawyers placed the original version of The Long and Winding Road, and then Phil Spector's orchestral version, arguing that the changes were substantial and unauthorized. They cited a telegram Paul had sent to Alan Klein stating, "Don't ever do it again," as evidence that Paul had lost creative control. The defense countered that Spector's work was an improvement and that 3 Beatles had approved it. They argued Paul was being unreasonable and obstructive. George Martin testified as a witness. He described the deterioration of the working relationship during the get-back sessions. "There was constant tension," Martin said in his testimony. "Paul wanted to direct everything. The others resented it. I found myself mediating arguments rather than producing music." He described the Abbey Road sessions as professional but emotionally cold. They were no longer collaborating. They were working in shifts. John would come in with Yoko and record his songs. George would come in separately. Paul would add overdubs alone. They rarely played together. When asked if the Beatles could function as a partnership going forward, Martin answered, "Not in any meaningful way, no." The judge ruled on March 12, 1971. He appointed a receiver, James Douglas Spooner, to manage the Beatles' affairs pending a full dissolution. In his judgment, Justice Stamp noted, "The parties have ceased to work together as a unit. The relationship of mutual trust and confidence has broken down." He acknowledged the grave consequences of the decision, but concluded that Paul's position as a minority partner being outvoted on all decisions was untenable. "It is not reasonable to expect Mr. McCartney to continue in a partnership where he has no effective voice." The judgment was a vindication of Paul's legal position, but a confirmation of the emotional catastrophe. The reaction from the other 3 was immediate and furious. George told Melody Maker, "Paul hasn't really thought about us. For Paul to get his own way, he's prepared to wreck the whole thing." John was more personal. "He's a cunning bastard," John said in an interview. "He knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted control and he couldn't get it, so he destroyed the whole thing rather than compromise." That night, according to multiple sources, John drove to Paul's house at Cavendish Avenue with George. John climbed the wall and threw a brick through a window. No one answered the door. The brick remained on the floor as a symbol of the rupture. The systemic pressures that had created the lawsuit were ignored in the public narrative. Fans and journalists preferred to assign blame to individuals. Paul was the villain who sued his friends. John was the disloyal one who chose Yoko. George was the ungrateful guitarist. Ringo was the passive bystander, but the actual causes were structural, a partnership agreement that required unanimity but provided no mechanism for resolving deadlock. A manager imposed by majority vote on a dissenting partner. A tax structure that trapped their money in a corporate entity they no longer controlled. A music industry that valued catalog ownership over artist autonomy. We were victims of the system we'd created. Paul reflected in 2001. We thought if we owned everything ourselves, the label, the publishing, the management, we'd be free. Instead, we built a cage. The aftermath of the lawsuit defined the decade. Paul was vilified by the music press. Rolling Stone ran a savage review of his second album, Ram, calling it monumentally irrelevant. John wrote, How Do You Sleep?, in response to lyrics on Ram, attacking Paul's character and music. Those freaks was right when they said you was dead. The only thing you done was yesterday. Paul responded more subtly with, Too many people and dear boy. But the hurt was profound. John's song was designed to wound, Paul said in 1984. And it did. It really did. We'd been through everything together, and now he was using that intimacy as a weapon. George's triple album, All Things Must Pass, was released in November 1970 and became a massive success, outselling any individual Beatles album. It felt like vindication, George said. All those songs I'd been told weren't good enough. The public loved them. His concert for Bangladesh in 1971 was a humanitarian triumph that none of the other Beatles participated in. George showed he didn't need us, Paul admitted. He was right. He didn't. Ringo's acting career and eventual all-star band tours allowed him to remain affable and professionally active. But his solo music struggled. I was never a songwriter, Ringo said. I was a Beatle. When that ended, I had to figure out what else I could be. The legal dissolution of the partnership took years to finalize. In 1973, the three other Beatles sued Alan Klein, finally recognizing what Paul had warned them about in 1969. Klein was removed as manager in 1977 after a settlement. The final partnership dissolution was signed in January 1975. The four former Beatles were legally separate entities for the first time since 1962. It took 5 years of lawsuits to undo what took 10 minutes to create, Paul said. The personal reconciliations were partial and painful. Paul and John exchanged letters and phone calls in the mid-1970s. They jammed together once in Los Angeles in 1974, recording informal sessions that were never officially released. It was nice, Paul said of the reunion. But it also made clear we could never really be Beatles again. Too much had happened. George remained distant from Paul until the 1990s. Ringo stayed friendly with everyone, serving as the emotional bridge. When John was murdered in December 1980, the three survivors were united in grief, but not in reconciliation with the past. John's death ended any possibility of really fixing things, Paul said. You can't apologize to a ghost. London, the Chancery Division of the High Court, December 31st, 1970. The sky is still the color of wet slate. The documents have been filed. The decade is ending not with a concert or an album, but with a legal writ. In Scotland, Paul McCartney walks through the mud toward his farmhouse, alone. He has done what he believed necessary. He has saved the Beatles' music by placing it in the hands of a court-appointed receiver. He has destroyed the partnership to protect the legacy. He enters the house, removes his muddy boots, and sits by the fire. Linda brings him tea. The radio is playing a Beatles song, Let It Be, the single with its gospel piano and hopeful lyrics. Paul listens without expression. The song is beautiful. The song is a lie. There will be no answer. There will be no resolution. There is only this: the lawsuit, the anger, the silence, the separate houses, the separate lives. The Beatles are over, legally and emotionally, and Paul McCartney is the man who made it official. He drinks his tea. Outside, the Scottish sky is the color of wet slate. Inside, the fire burns. The music plays. The damage is done. The case is filed. The dream is documented, notarized, and archived. The partnership known as the Beatles is dissolved. The work continues alone.